A simple tea, and the caretaker watching everything with the eyes of an owner. His humility hid a power that would change her life. Two wounded hearts meet by accident, and a secret capable of turning her fate upside down. Chapter 1. Emily had always believed that love was something solid, something you build brick by brick with patience, with dedication, with the certainty that every gesture counts. She had invested 3 years of her life in that construction. 3 years by Thomas's side, sharing dreams, plans, lazy weekends and impromptu dinners. 3 years believing she was building something that would last forever. Until, on a random Thursday afternoon, everything collapsed with the force of a silent gale. She hadn't even planned on coming home early. The afternoon meeting had been cancelled at the last minute, and Emily took advantage of the gap in her schedule to leave the office before the usual chaos of New York City traffic. She went up the 12 floors of the building on Fifth Avenue where she lived, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the last few months of intense work. She worked as a senior financial analyst at a large consulting firm, and that year had been particularly demanding. Promotions, targets, pressure. She barely had time to breathe. But whenever she got home, Thomas was there. Or he was supposed to be. She opened the apartment door with the lightness of someone expecting to find comfort. The sound of the television came from the living room, mixed with muffled laughter. Emily frowned. Thomas never watched television in the afternoon. He worked in systems development and usually spent the entire day glued to his computer, headphones isolating him from the world around. That was already strange. But what she saw next was devastating. On the living room sofa, half slumped on the cushions she herself had chosen with such care, was Thomas. And he wasn't alone. A blonde woman with long hair and a confident smile was sitting next to him, leaning in a way that was far too intimate to be just a work colleague. Their hands were intertwined, and worse, much worse than any scene Emily could have imagined, was the naturalness with which they were there, as if that space belonged to her too. Emily froze. Her fingers still held the key in the lock. Her heart raced, but her body didn't obey the command to move. It was Thomas who saw her first. He looked up, and for a moment, just for a brief moment, Emily saw panic settle on his face. But then he tried to cover it up, forcing a weak smile and saying something about the woman being just a friend from work, who had stopped by to pick up some files. Emily didn't hear, or rather, she heard, but the words lost their meaning. She felt as if she were underwater, watching everything through a fogged-up window. The blonde woman stood up quickly, uncomfortable, murmuring apologies that went nowhere. Emily simply turned her back and left. She didn't scream. She didn't cry there, in front of them. She didn't give them the pleasure of seeing her fall apart in real time. She simply closed the door behind her and walked down the hallway, feeling her legs tremble. She leaned against the cold wall and let the air escape slowly. She needed to think. She needed to understand what had just happened. But her mind was blank, occupied only by a dull, heavy pain that settled in her chest and showed no signs of leaving. Hours later, when she finally managed to gather the strength to return to the apartment, Thomas was no longer there. He had left a note on the kitchen table, a few handwritten lines apologizing, saying that everything had gotten out of control, that he didn't want to hurt her, that he needed some time to think. Emily crumpled the paper in her fingers and threw it in the trash. There was nothing left to think about. It was over. In the following days, she moved on autopilot. She went to work, smiled when necessary, answered emails, participated in meetings, but inside she felt as if she had lost something essential, something that connected her to the world. The betrayal wasn't just about Thomas. It was about the trust she had placed in life, in the idea that good things come to those who try, to those who believe. And now everything seemed like an illusion too fragile to stand. It was Julia, her best friend since college, who insisted that Emily leave the house. Julia was her opposite in many ways. Extroverted, spontaneous, always ready to turn any situation into something lighter. She showed up at Emily's apartment on a Friday night, bringing a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and an unwavering determination to pull her friend out of that state of emotional paralysis. You're not going to spend the whole weekend here, sunk into this couch, staring at the ceiling as if the world has ended, Julia said, opening the bottle with impressive skill. Emily sighed but had no strength to argue. Julia was like that. When she decided something, there was no stopping her. They drank, they talked, they laughed at silly things. And then, somewhere between the second and third glass of wine, Julia had an idea. "Let's record a video," she said, her eyes glinting with mischief. "A really daring video. Just so you can see you still have power, that you're still desired, that he was an idiot to lose you." Emily laughed, but it was a weak, powerless laugh. "That's ridiculous, Julia. I'm not recording anything." But Julia was already on her feet, adjusting the living room light, positioning her phone on a makeshift stand. "Come on, Em. Just one video. You don't even have to send it. It's just to make you feel good about yourself." The wine had softened the barriers Emily usually built around her own emotions. She stood up, a bit wobbly, and let Julia guide her. The video was recorded. Nothing explicit, nothing vulgar, but enough to be daring. To be a small emotional revenge that Emily knew she would never have the courage to carry out. When it was over, she took the phone from Julia's hands, looked at the screen, and felt a mix of shame and relief. "I'm not sending this," she repeated, more to herself than to her friend. Julia shrugged. "You don't have to, but now you know you can." They drank a little more, talked about things that didn't matter, and when exhaustion finally won, Julia said goodbye, making Emily promise she would leave the house the next day, even if it was just to get some air. Emily agreed, knowing she probably wouldn't keep the promise. When she was alone, reality weighed down on her again. The apartment was too quiet. Every room held memories of Thomas. The mug he used every morning was still in the sink. The forgotten T-shirt on the back of the chair. The toothbrush he never came back for. Emily gathered everything in a cardboard box. She didn't want to see those objects anymore. She didn't want to carry that weight anymore. It was almost midnight when she decided to go down to the building's trash to get rid of that box. She put on a baggy sweatshirt, slipped on some flip-flops, and left the apartment holding the box against her chest. The hallway was empty and silent. Most of the residents were already in for the night. Emily took the elevator down to the basement where the dumpsters were. The air there was heavy, smelling of dampness and concrete. She threw the box into one of the containers and stood there for a moment, looking into the emptiness. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly and saw a man walking towards her. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans and a grey T-shirt, and carried a toolbox in his hand. Emily had seen him a few times in the building's hallways, always going up and down stairs, always with that discreet and silent air. She assumed he was a technician or someone who provided maintenance services for the condominium. He stopped a few feet from her and tilted his head slightly in a respectful greeting. "Good evening," he said, with a calm, deep voice. Emily just nodded, without saying anything. She wasn't in the mood for conversation, but then he spoke again. "Is everything all right?" The question caught her by surprise, not because of the question itself, but because of the way it was asked. There was a genuine concern in those words, an attention Emily didn't expect to receive from a stranger. She hesitated, feeling her eyes burn. Everything was fine until he asked, until he broke that thin barrier she had built to protect herself. "I'm fine," she lied, but her voice came out shaky. The man didn't insist. He just stood there, as if he were willing to wait as long as necessary. And then, without knowing exactly why, Emily felt the tears stream down. She tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed, but they kept falling. The man took a step forward, slowly, as if afraid of scaring her. "If you need to talk, I can listen," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything. Just listen." Emily looked at him, really looked for the first time. He had dark, deep eyes, a face marked by a serenity she couldn't decipher. There was something about him that inspired trust, a calmness that made her, even without understanding, feel like letting her guard down. They stood there talking in the basement of the building for almost an hour. Emily talked about the breakup, about the betrayal, about the feeling of having invested years in an illusion. He listened in silence without interrupting her, without offering empty advice or clichés. He just listened, and that somehow was more comforting than any words could be. When they finally said goodbye, Emily felt something different. It wasn't relief, it wasn't happiness, but it was a feeling that perhaps the world wasn't as hostile as it seemed. She went back to her apartment, lay down in bed, and slept for the first time in days without waking up in the middle of the night. The next morning, a sunny Saturday, Emily was awakened by the sound of the intercom. She answered sleepily, her head still heavy from the previous night's wine. It was the doorman. "Good morning, Miss Emily. The gentleman from the top floor asked to confirm tea for tonight. You confirmed yesterday, didn't you?" Emily was confused. Tea? What tea? She didn't remember confirming anything. And what's more, she didn't know anyone on the top floor. That floor had always seemed mysterious to her, almost uninhabited. She rarely saw anyone going up there. "It must be a mistake," she told the doorman. "I haven't arranged anything with anyone," but the doorman insisted. "No, Miss Emily. The gentleman was very clear. He said you accepted the invitation last night." Emily hung up the intercom, feeling a growing unease. Had she said something last night that she didn't remember? Had she, in her conversation with that man in the basement, accepted some invitation without realizing it? She tried to remember the details, but everything was a bit hazy. The wine, the emotional exhaustion, the vulnerability, it all blended into a confusing fog. She decided to go up to the top floor to clear up the misunderstanding. She put on simple clothes, tied her hair in a ponytail, and took the elevator. As she went up, she felt her heart speed up. There was something strange about this situation, something that didn't add up. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Emily found herself in a hallway different from the others. The walls were covered with elegant wallpaper. There were paintings hanging, and a soft lighting gave the environment a sophisticated air. It was as if she were in another building. She walked to the only door on the floor and rang the bell. She waited. The seconds seemed to drag on, and then the door opened. It was him, the man from the basement, but no longer in simple clothes and with a toolbox. He wore a white dress shirt, impeccably ironed, tailored trousers, and shoes that clearly cost more than Emily earned in a month. His hair was combed back and his posture was different, firm, confident, imposing. Emily stood paralyzed. Her brain tried to process what she was seeing, but the pieces didn't fit. How was he here? And why was he dressed like that? "Good afternoon, Emily," he said with a slight smile on his lips. "I've missed you since last night. Please come in." She didn't move. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat. He noticed her confusion and took a step back, making room for her to enter. "I know you must be surprised, but I can explain." Emily finally found her voice, though it came out weak and shaky. "Who are you?" He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "My name is Richard Almeida, and I own this building." Emily's world collapsed for the second time in less than a week. She took a step back, incredulous. The owner of the building? But how? She had seen him so many times in the hallways, always in simple clothes, always carrying boxes and tools, always so discreet. How could he be the owner of the building? "And that's not all," Richard continued, with a calmness that only increased Emily's confusion. "I also own the company where you work." Emily felt her legs go weak. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The company where she worked was a giant in the consulting market, with branches all over the country, and the owner, the president, was an almost mythical figure, someone who avoided public appearances, who kept his personal life out of the spotlight. She had never seen a picture of him, never heard his voice. And now, this man, this stranger to whom she had vented in the basement of a building, was saying that it was him. "You must be kidding," Emily said, her voice coming out louder than she intended. "Is this some kind of prank?" Richard shook his head, serious. "It's not a prank. I understand it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. Last night when we met, you had no idea who I was. And that's precisely why I wanted to talk to you. It's been so long since someone has seen me as an ordinary person. It's been so long since people have been sincere with me, have talked to me without ulterior motives. You were real, and I needed that." Emily didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to turn her back and run. Another part, a smaller, more curious part, wanted to understand. Wanted to know why he pretended to be someone else, why he hid. "Please come in," Richard repeated with a disarming kindness. "I promise I can explain everything, and if you want to leave afterwards, I'll understand." Emily hesitated. Everything in her screamed to get out of there, to flee from that strange and potentially dangerous situation. But something made her stay. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that the night before he had been the only person who had really listened to her. Or maybe it was just the need to understand what was happening. She entered. The apartment was spacious, with a minimalist and elegant decor. Large glass windows offered a panoramic view of New York, with buildings stretching as far as the eye could see. There were works of art on the walls, impeccable designer furniture, and a sense of order and control that completely contrasted with the image Emily had formed of him. Richard closed the door and walked to the kitchen, returning with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Emily, who accepted it mechanically, not knowing what to do. "Sit down," he said, indicating the sofa. "Let's talk." They sat, and for a long moment no one said anything. Emily looked at the tea in her cup, trying to organize her thoughts. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. "Why did you pretend to be someone else?" Richard sighed, as if gathering the courage to tell something he had kept for a long time. "Because I was tired. Tired of being just a name, a title, a bank account. People see me and only see what I represent. They don't care about who I really am, and over time that consumed me. So, a few months ago, I started walking through the building's hallways dressed simply, carrying boxes, pretending to be just someone else. And you know what happened? People started greeting me, smiling at me, treating me like a human being. It was liberating." Emily listened in silence, trying to process everything. There was a deep sadness in Richard's words, a loneliness she recognized. Because deep down she felt that way too, invisible, reduced to a function, to a role she played at work, in life, in relationships. "And last night," Richard continued, "when I saw you there, in the basement, throwing that box away, I saw something in your eyes that I know well. I saw the pain of someone who lost something important, and I wanted to help you. Not as the owner of the building or as your boss, but as someone who understands what it's like to feel broken." Emily felt the tears threaten to return. She clutched the cup in her hands, seeking some kind of emotional anchor. But it was too much information, too much accumulated emotion. She stood up, placing the cup on the table. "I have to go," she said, her voice failing. "This is too much. I need to think." Richard stood up too, but didn't try to stop her. "I understand, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention. But Emily, if you need anything, if you want to talk, I'll be here. Not as your boss, but as someone who cares." Emily nodded, unable to look at him. She left the apartment and entered the elevator, pressing the button for her floor with trembling hands. When the doors closed, she leaned her head against the cold elevator wall and let the tears fall freely. What was happening to her life? First, Thomas's betrayal. Now this. A man she thought was a simple service provider revealed to be the owner of the building and the company where she worked. It was too surreal to be true, and yet it was. When she got to her apartment, Emily threw herself on the sofa and stared at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Part of her was furious. Furious for being deceived. Furious for having opened up to someone who wasn't who he claimed to be. But another part, a part she didn't want to admit, felt something different. It felt a connection, a mutual understanding she hadn't felt in a long time. She picked up her phone and saw she had messages from Julia. Several messages asking how she was, if she had left the house, if she needed company. Emily typed a quick reply saying she was fine, that she just needed some time alone. But it wasn't true. She wasn't fine. And she didn't know if she ever would be again. The days that followed were strange. Emily avoided leaving the apartment whenever possible. She ordered food delivery, worked from home using the excuse that she wasn't feeling well. She didn't want to risk running into Richard in the hallways. She didn't want to have to deal with that situation. But then, on a Tuesday morning, when she went out to take out the trash, she found a note stuck to her apartment door. It was a simple sheet of paper with an elegant and precise handwriting. It just said, "Thank you for the tea last night. It was the best conversation I've had in years. Richard." Emily held the note, feeling her heart speed up. He was referring to their meeting in the basement, not the meeting in his apartment. He was maintaining the fiction that that moment had been real, and in a way it had been. At that moment, he wasn't the owner of the building, he wasn't her boss. He was just a man listening to a woman vent. She put the note in a kitchen drawer, not knowing why, and over the next week, more notes appeared. Always discreet, always kind. Some commented on the weather, others brought small observations about the city. One of them had just one sentence: "I hope you're doing well." Emily didn't reply to any of them, but she didn't throw them away either. She kept them, all of them, in a small box she used to store buttons and pins. And every time she opened that box, she felt something strange in her chest, something she couldn't name. At work, things continued as normal. She participated in meetings, delivered reports, met deadlines. But now, whenever someone mentioned the company's president, Emily felt a knot in her stomach. She knew who he was. She knew what he was doing. And that left her torn between anger and a curiosity that grew with each passing day. It was on a Friday night, almost 3 weeks after the encounter on the top floor, that Emily finally allowed herself to really think about it all. She was alone in the apartment with a cup of tea in her hands, looking out the window at the city lights. And then, without understanding exactly why, she picked up her phone and typed a short message. She sent it to the number Richard had left on one of the notes, in case she wanted to talk to him. The message just said, "Thank you for listening to me that night." The reply came almost instantly. "It was a pleasure, and the offer still stands. If you need to talk, I'll be here." Emily smiled. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was a smile. And at that moment, sitting alone in the apartment, looking at the city lights, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for something new in her life, something she didn't expect, something that scared her and at the same time intrigued her deeply. Chapter 2. The days passed with a strangeness that Emily still couldn't define. It was as if her life had split into two parallel worlds. On one side, there was the real world, predictable and safe, where she woke up every morning, had coffee, took the crowded subway on Fifth Avenue, and faced another day of spreadsheets, meetings, and tight deadlines. On the other, there was this new world, silent and unsettling, where notes appeared on her apartment door, and a man she barely knew occupied her thoughts with a frequency that scared her. Emily tried to convince herself that it was just curiosity, just the novelty of an unusual situation. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. There was something about Richard that disarmed her. Maybe it was the way he had listened to her that night in the basement, without judgment, without rushing. Or maybe it was the vulnerability he had revealed when he told her about his own loneliness. Whatever the reason, Emily couldn't get him out of her head. The notes continued to appear, never every day, but with a frequency that created a kind of anticipation. Sometimes it was just a short sentence, other times an observation about something that had happened in the city. One of them said, "Today, I saw an elderly couple dancing in the square. It reminded me that the simple things are the most beautiful." Another just had, "I hope your day was light." Emily saved them all. And although she never responded directly, she began to leave small signs that she had received them. Once, she left a cup of coffee on her doorstep with a note that just said, "Thank you." When she returned a few hours later, the cup was gone and in its place was a single white rose. No message, just the flower. It became a kind of silent game between them, a communication that dispensed with words but said much more than any conversation could. And Emily, who had spent the last few months feeling invisible and disposable, began to feel seen again. Not in the superficial way Thomas saw her, but in a deeper, more attentive way. It was Julia who noticed the change. They were having lunch at a small Japanese restaurant near the office when her friend stopped in the middle of a story about the new intern at the company and looked at Emily with that penetrating gaze she knew so well. "What's going on with you?" Julia asked, narrowing her eyes. "You're different." Emily tried to play it off, shrugging as she poked at her poke bowl with her chopsticks. "Nothing's going on, I'm normal." "Liar. You've had that silly little smile on your face for days, and I know you, Em. There's something there. Spill." Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to share it with someone, to vent about the strange and confusing situation she was in. But another part was afraid that, by putting it into words, it would all lose its charm, that it would seem less special, less real. "I just met someone," she said finally, keeping her tone casual. "Nothing serious, just someone from the building." Julia's eyes lit up. "Met someone? Already?" "Wow, Em." "That's great. Who is he? What's he like? Have you gone out with him yet?" "Not yet. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Emily sighed. "He's the owner of the building, and he's also my boss." Julia almost spat out the juice she was drinking. "What? Your boss? Em, you're kidding. Don't tell me it's Richard Almeida." "The Richard Almeida?" Emily blinked, surprised. "You know him?" Julia gave an incredulous laugh. "Of course I know him. I mean, not personally, but everyone in the business world knows who he is. The guy's a legend, took over his father's company at 25 and turned it into an empire. But he's super reclusive. No one ever sees him at events, at parties, anywhere. Some people say he's kind of eccentric, that he doesn't like to be seen." Emily swallowed hard. That was exactly it. Richard was an almost mythical figure, and she, without knowing it, had talked to him in the basement of a building, thinking he was just some maintenance guy. "And you're telling me this guy is leaving notes on your door?" Julia shook her head, still processing the information. "Em, this is surreal, like movie-level surreal. Do you have any idea who he is?" "I do, and that's exactly why it's complicated." Julia was silent for a moment, and then her face took on a more serious expression. "Em, you have to be careful. I don't want to be a buzzkill here, but powerful men are complicated. They have resources, influence, and sometimes that can be dangerous. You barely know this guy." Emily knew her friend was right, but at the same time, there was something about Richard that told her he wasn't like that he was different. Or maybe she was just deluding herself again, like she did with Thomas. "I'll take it slow," Emily promised. "I'm not going to do anything crazy." But inside she already felt like she was, accepting the notes, keeping the flowers, responding to that silent game. All of it was already crazy. That night, when she got home, Emily found another note. This time it was different from the others, more direct, more personal. It said, "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? No pressure, no expectations, just a conversation." Richard. Emily held the paper, feeling her heart speed up. This was an official invitation. No more games of notes and flowers. It was a step forward, and she needed to decide if she was ready to take that step. She spent the whole night awake, weighing the pros and cons. On one side, there were all the rational reasons to refuse. He was her boss. He was a powerful and influential man. She barely knew him, and her last relationship had ended in disaster. On the other side, there was something she couldn't ignore, a connection that seemed too real to be dismissed without at least a chance. The next morning, before leaving for work, Emily wrote a response. On a piece of paper. Just 2 words: "I accept. Yes." She left the note on her door and left without looking back, her heart pounding in her chest. The day at the office was torture. Emily could barely concentrate. Every time the phone rang, every time she received an email, her heart leaped. She didn't know what this dinner would be like, what they expected from each other, or if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. When it was finally time to go home, Emily rushed back. She took a long shower, spent almost an hour, choosing what to wear. She opted for something elegant, but not over the top. A simple, discreet navy blue dress with a pair of flat shoes. She tied her hair in a loose bun and applied just a light touch of lipstick. She wanted to look natural, but at the same time she wanted to look beautiful. At 8 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Emily opened the door, and there was Richard. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and dark pants. His hair was slightly messy, as if he had run his hand through it. Several times, he was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said, handing her the flowers. Emily accepted, feeling her face flush. "Thank you. They're beautiful." They looked at each other for a moment, and Emily realized that Richard was nervous too. There was a tension in the air, but it was a good tension, charged with anticipation. "Ready?" he asked. Emily nodded, grabbed her purse, and left with him. They went down in the elevator in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. When they reached the garage, Emily expected to see a luxury car, something ostentatious and flashy. But Richard led her to a discreet and elegant black sedan. "You don't like to draw attention, do you?" Emily commented, half joking. Richard smiled. "I've learned that the more you try to hide, the more people want to find you, so I hide without hiding. I move around the city like everyone else. No one expects a rich businessman to be driving a regular car, eating at a simple restaurant, walking the streets. And that's precisely why I can go unnoticed." They left the building and drove through the streets of New York. The city was alive as always. Flashing lights, people rushing from one place to another, the constant noise of traffic. But inside the car, there was a bubble of tranquility. Richard didn't take Emily to a fancy restaurant. Instead, he stopped in front of a small Italian trattoria in Little Italy, hidden on a side street Emily had never noticed before. The place was cozy, with wooden tables, lit candles, and a delicious smell of garlic and basil in the air. "I hope you like Italian food," Richard said, opening the door for her. "I love it. But I admit I'm surprised. I thought you'd take me somewhere more sophisticated." Richard laughed. "Sophisticated is boring. Here the food is real, made with love, not to impress." They sat at a table in the corner, away from the hustle and bustle. The owner of the restaurant, an Italian gentleman with a thick accent, greeted Richard with familiarity as if they were old friends. This only increased Emily's curiosity. "Do you come here often?" she asked. "Every chance I get. Domenico, the owner, is a genius, and he doesn't care who I am. To him, I'm just another customer who appreciates good food." They ordered wine, bruschetta appetizer, and for the main course a mushroom risotto that Domenico guaranteed was the best in the city. And while they waited, they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, about the differences between growing up in New York and in smaller cities, about the places they had visited, about books they liked and songs that had marked them. Emily discovered that Richard was passionate about history, that he had a huge collection of old books at home and spent hours reading about ancient civilizations. She also discovered that he played the piano, but rarely played for anyone. That he had learned to cook when he first lived alone at 18 because he couldn't stand the idea of depending on other people for basic things. "And you?" Richard asked, leaning forward slightly. "What was it like growing up in Columbus?" Emily smiled. "It was quiet. A smaller city where everyone knows everyone. My parents had a hardware store. Nothing glamorous, but it was ours. I grew up helping at the counter, taking orders, organizing shelves. I learned the value of honest work from an early age. And why New York? Because I wanted more. Not that Columbus was bad, but I felt I needed a place where I could grow, challenge myself. So as soon as I graduated with a business degree, I came here. I got the job at the company and never left." Richard was silent for a moment, observing her. "There's something about you that intrigues me, Emily. A quiet strength. You don't shout, you don't impose yourself, but you're always there, firm. It's rare to find that." Emily felt her face flush. She wasn't used to compliments like that, so direct and sincere. "I could say the same about you. You manage to be invisible, and at the same time impossible to ignore. They laughed, and the initial tension gave way to a lightness that Emily hadn't felt in a long time. The food arrived, and it was delicious. The risotto was creamy, with an intense flavor of mushrooms and a hint of white wine that exploded on the palate. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, talking between sips of wine. When the night ended, Richard drove Emily back home. They stood in the hallway in front of her apartment door, not quite sure how to say goodbye. "Thank you for the evening," Emily said. "It was one of the best I've had in a long time." "For me too. Can I see you again?" Emily hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid of getting hurt again, afraid of giving herself over to something that might just be an illusion. "We can try," she replied finally, "but slowly, no rush." Richard smiled. "No rush, I promise." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gesture so gentle and respectful that it made Emily's heart ache. And then he said goodbye and left, leaving her alone in the hallway with the feeling that something important had just begun. The following days were different. Emily and Richard began to see each other more often, always discreetly, always away from prying eyes. Dinners in hidden restaurants, walks in the park at night, long conversations in his apartment, with the city lights in the background. But Emily knew they couldn't keep it a secret forever. And the first crack in that bubble of privacy came from where she least expected it. It was at a board meeting at the company. Emily had been called to present a report on the financial performance of the last quarter. It was an important meeting with all the directors present. She entered the conference room, greeted those present, and began her presentation. She was in the middle of a slide on growth projections when the door opened. And there he was, Richard, wearing an impeccable suit with a firm posture and a serious look that Emily didn't recognize. He greeted the room with a nod and sat at the head of the table. Emily felt the world spin. She knew he was the owner of the company, but she had never imagined he would show up at a meeting like this. He always stayed away, delegating responsibilities to the directors, but there he was, looking directly at her, waiting for her to continue the presentation. She swallowed hard and tried to compose herself. She continued speaking, explaining the numbers, answering questions. But she felt Richard's eyes fixed on her the whole time. And worse, she felt the eyes of the other directors alternating between her and Richard, as if they were trying to decipher something. When the meeting ended, Emily quickly left the room without looking back. Her heart was racing. She needed to process what had just happened. She needed to understand if anyone had noticed anything. It was Maurice, the chief financial officer, who approached her in the hallway. Maurice was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. There was always something calculating about him, something that made Emily uncomfortable. "Great presentation, Emily," he said, blocking her path. The president seemed very impressed. "Thank you," Emily replied, trying to keep her tone professional. "I tried to be as clear as possible with the data." "Yes? He really paid a lot of attention to you. By the way, it's rare to see him in one of these meetings. There must be a special reason." There was something in the way Maurice said that put Emily on alert. A veiled insinuation, a tone that suggested he knew something. She decided not to take the bait. "I imagine he's closely monitoring the company's results," she replied, keeping her voice firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to work." She walked past Maurice without looking back, but she felt the weight of his gaze on her back. And at that moment, Emily knew that things had gotten more complicated, much more complicated. That night, she received a message from Richard. "Sorry for showing up at the meeting without warning. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable, but I needed to be there. I needed to see you work." "And you were incredible," Emily replied. "It was strange. People were looking." "I know, and I apologize for that, but I don't regret it. I want them to know that you are competent, that you deserve to be there, regardless of me." Richard's words were comforting, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And she was right, because the next morning, when she arrived at the office, she found an anonymous letter inside her desk drawer. The envelope was white, with no return address, no identification. Emily opened it with trembling hands and read the words written in letters cut out from magazines in a style that seemed straight out of a thriller movie. Be careful of those who pretend to be invisible. All that glitters is not gold, and you might be closer to the fire than you think. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. This was a threat. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And worse, someone wanted her to know it. She put the letter in the bottom of her purse and tried to go on with her day as if nothing had happened. But inside, she felt that the ground was beginning to crack, and that soon everything would come crashing down. Chapter 3. Emily spent the next few days in a state of constant alert. The anonymous letter had planted a seed of paranoia that grew with every glance she received at the office, every conversation that stopped when she walked down the halls, every silence that fell when she entered a room. She began to wonder who could be behind it. Maurice was the most obvious suspect, with his calculating looks and innuendo-laden comments. But it could be anyone. Someone who envied her. Someone who had their own interests at stake. Or worse, someone who actually cared about what was happening and wanted to protect her from something she couldn't yet see. She didn't tell Richard about the letter. Not right away. Part of her was afraid he would overreact, that he would take drastic measures that would end up drawing even more attention to them. Another part simply didn't know how to broach the subject. How do you tell someone you're starting to care about that you might be being watched, monitored, judged? It was on a Friday night, when they were at his apartment, that Emily finally gathered the courage to speak. They had just finished dinner, a simple meal that Richard had prepared himself. He was a surprisingly good cook, something Emily had discovered in recent weeks. He liked to make fresh pasta, homemade sauces, desserts that filled the apartment with comforting smells. They were sitting on the couch, each with a glass of wine in hand, when Emily put her glass on the table and turned to him. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice coming out more serious than she intended. Richard immediately became attentive, noticing the change in her tone. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath and told him about the letter, about the cut-out words, the veiled threat, the feeling of being watched. As she spoke, she saw Richard's face harden, his jaw tensing. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below, his hands in his pockets. "I knew this would happen," he said finally, without turning around. "I knew at some point someone would notice, would question it, would use it against us." Emily stood up too and went to him. She placed her hand on Richard's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Are you scared?" Richard turned to her, and there was something in his eyes that Emily hadn't seen before. A deep vulnerability, an old pain. "I'm not scared for myself," he said. "I'm scared for you. I'm scared that my life, my position, my past will end up hurting you, and I couldn't bear that." Emily felt her chest tighten. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "I know what I'm getting into, Richard, and I choose to be here. I choose you." They kissed. It was the first real kiss, charged with all the fear, all the uncertainty, and all the intensity they had held back until that moment. When they broke apart, Richard rested his forehead against hers, breathing deeply. "I'll find out who's doing this," he promised, "and I'll protect you." But Emily knew that protecting her wouldn't be that simple, because the threats weren't just coming from inside the company, they were coming from a past that Richard had tried to bury, but that was now resurfacing with devastating force. The first appearance of Richard's ex-wife happened on a Monday morning. Emily was leaving the building to go to work when she saw an elegant woman standing on the sidewalk, clearly waiting for someone. She wore an impeccable beige tailored suit, perfectly styled blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and sunglasses too big for her face. There was something about her that screamed class, money, and power. Emily walked past her without paying much attention, but then the woman spoke. "You must be Emily." Emily stopped in her tracks and turned around. "Excuse me?" The woman took off her sunglasses, revealing green eyes as cold as ice. "My name is Patricia Almeida, or rather, it was Almeida. Now I'm back to using my maiden name, Patricia Mendes. I'm Richard's ex-wife." Emily felt her stomach churn. She looked around, checking if anyone was nearby, but the street was relatively empty at that time. "What do you want?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Patricia smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just wanted to meet the woman who managed to get my ex-husband's attention. Richard is a difficult man, you know. Complex, full of layers. I spent 10 years by his side and still felt like I never really knew him." Emily didn't know what to say. There was something unsettling about this woman, a calculated coldness that made her want to run. "I don't know what he told you about our marriage," Patricia continued, taking a few steps toward Emily. "But I'll give you some woman-to-woman advice. Be careful. Richard has a way of making people feel special, unique. But in the end, he always puts business first. Always." Emily lifted her chin, refusing to let that woman see how her words affected her. "Thank you for the advice, but I think I can take care of myself." Patricia smiled again, a smile that had a triumphant air. "Of course you can. See you around, Emily. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." She put her sunglasses back on and got into a black car that was parked nearby. Emily stood on the sidewalk, watching the car drive away, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. Who did that woman think she was to come giving unsolicited advice? And more importantly, what did she really want? At work, things remained tense. Maurice had started watching her even more closely. In a team meeting, he made a comment about how some people rose quickly in the company without clear merit, looking directly at Emily when he said it. She swallowed her anger and responded professionally, presenting all the numbers and results that justified her position. But she knew this was just the beginning. The last straw came on a Thursday afternoon. Emily was in the middle of a video conference with international clients when her phone vibrated discreetly. It was a message from Julia, all in capital letters. "EM, check the company group chat. Now." Emily felt a knot in her chest. She tried to stay focused on the meeting, but as soon as it ended, she picked up her phone with trembling hands and opened the app. There was an internal company group, used for general communications and announcements. And there at the top of the most recent messages was a photo. It was her and Richard. It was nothing compromising, but it was clearly an intimate moment. They were in a restaurant, sitting across from each other, and Richard was holding her hand on the table. The photo had been taken from a distance, probably with a zoom lens, but it was clear enough to leave no doubt. Below the photo, someone had written, "Is this why some people are getting promotions?" Emily felt the world collapse around her. She looked around the office, seeing people at their desks, some looking at their computers, others talking among themselves. How many of them had already seen that photo? How many were judging, commenting, speculating? She stood up quickly, grabbed her purse, and left the office without saying anything to anyone. She needed to get out of there. She needed to breathe. She needed to think. Emily walked through the streets of New York with no destination in mind. The city was bustling as always, but she felt completely disconnected from it all. People passed her by, horns honked, street vendors shouted their offers. But all she could think about was that photo, about how her privacy had been invaded, about how her reputation was being destroyed. She didn't know how long she had been walking when she finally stopped. She was in a park, sitting on a bench, looking at the trees swaying in the wind. She picked up her phone and saw she had several messages, from Julia asking if she was okay, from Richard saying he was already aware of what had happened and wanted to talk to her, from co-workers, some offering support, others just being curious. It was then that she saw a missed call from an unknown number, and right after, a message from the same number. It was a video. With her heart pounding, Emily clicked to open it. It was the video. The video she had recorded with Julia on that night of wine and impulse. The video she had never sent, that was saved on her phone, that she was sure no one else had access to. But there it was, in someone's hands. And along with the video, a simple message. Imagine if this leaks too. Be careful with your choices. Emily felt the tears stream down. This was getting out of control. It was no longer just an anonymous letter or a stolen photo. It was an orchestrated campaign to destroy her, to destroy what she and Richard were building. She called Richard. He answered on the first ring. Emily, where are you? I'm worried. In the park, near the office. Richard, they have a video of me, something I recorded on a silly night that should never have existed, and they're threatening me with it. There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. Then Richard spoke, his voice low and controlled but filled with anger. Stay there, I'm coming to get you, and we're going to solve this. Together. 20 minutes later, Richard's discreet car pulled up beside the park. Emily got in, and they drove in silence to his apartment. When they arrived, Richard led her to the sofa and sat beside her, holding her hands. Tell me everything, he requested, and Emily told him. About the night with Julia, about the wine, about the video recorded in a moment of weakness, about how she had never sent it to anyone, never shared it. But somehow, someone had gained access. Richard listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, processing the information. This isn't random, he said finally. This is orchestrated. Someone is digging deep into your life, looking for anything they can use against you. And I have a suspicion who it is. Who? Maurice, the CFO. He's always wanted my position, always thought he should be the one in charge. And now, with you in the middle, he's seen an opportunity to destabilize me, to question my decisions, to cast doubt on my ability to lead without letting my personal life interfere. Emily felt the anger grow. And what are we going to do? Richard stood up and walked to the window. I'm going to confront him tomorrow. I'll make it clear that I won't tolerate this kind of behavior, and I'll make sure you're protected. But Emily shook her head. No, Richard. If you do that, it will look like you're defending me because we're a couple. It will just add more fuel to the gossip. We have to be smarter than that. Richard turned to her, impressed. You're right. So what do you suggest? Emily thought for a moment. We have to expose who's behind this, prove that it's sabotage, and we need to do it in a way that doesn't look like you're interfering for me. And how are we going to do that? Emily smiled, despite everything. I'll investigate. I'll find out who's doing this, and when we have proof, we'll act. Richard hesitated. I don't want you to put yourself at risk. I'm already at risk. The difference is that now I'm going to fight back. In the following days, Emily became an unlikely detective. She started paying attention to the details, to who watched her at the office, to who asked questions about her personal life, to who had access to the company's internal systems, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Maurice wasn't acting alone. He had an assistant, Fernanda, a young and ambitious woman who clearly saw him as a ladder to climb in the company. It was Fernanda whom Emily saw leaving the building late at night, looking around before getting into a waiting car. It was Fernanda she noticed whispering with other employees, always falling silent when Emily approached. But there was someone else involved, someone who had the resources to hack Emily's phone, to gain access to private files. And that someone could only be from outside the company. It was Julia who provided the missing piece of the puzzle. They were talking at a coffee shop near the office when Julia casually mentioned something she had heard in the elevator. You know Patricia, Richard's ex-wife? I heard she's trying to renegotiate the divorce settlement, something about clauses that were signed that she now wants to revise. Emily felt something click in her mind. Of course, Patricia had everything to gain by creating problems for Richard. If she could prove he was involved in an inappropriate relationship with an employee, she could use that as justification to revise the terms of the divorce. She could claim he had violated some code of conduct or business ethics. It all fit. Maurice wanted Richard's position. Patricia wanted more money and perhaps revenge, and Emily was the perfect pawn for both of them to achieve their goals. She told Richard her findings that night. He listened attentively, his face growing more serious. It makes sense, he admitted. Patricia has always been calculating, and Maurice has never hidden his ambition. Together, they're a dangerous combination. So, what do we do? Richard was silent for a moment. Then he looked at Emily with a determination she hadn't seen before. We're going to turn the tables. We'll expose them before they can cause any more damage. They spent the night devising a plan. Richard would use his contacts to investigate Patricia's activities more deeply. Emily would continue to watch Maurice and Fernanda at the office, collecting evidence of their actions, and when they had enough proof, they would make a decisive move. But before they could put their plan into action, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday night. Emily was at Richard's apartment, helping him review financial documents when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered, hesitant. "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a female voice, distorted by some kind of modulator, spoke. "If you value your career and your reputation, you will break up with Richard Almeida. You will leave the company and you will disappear from his life. You have 48 hours to decide." Before Emily could respond, the call ended. She stood there, the phone still in her hand, her heart beating uncontrollably. Richard noticed the change in her expression. "What was it?" Emily told him about the call, about the threat, about the ultimatum. And as she spoke, she saw the anger grow on Richard's face. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They can't do this to you. I won't allow it." But Emily was tired. Tired of being threatened, tired of feeling cornered, tired of having to hide. A part of her, a small but insistent part, began to wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just give up. Break up with Richard. Leave the company. Start over somewhere else, far from all this mess. Richard noticed her hesitation. He knelt in front of Emily, taking her hands. "Look at me," he pleaded. "Emily, I know this is hard. I know you're exhausted. But we can't let them win. We can't let them destroy what we're building." Emily looked at him, feeling tears burn in her eyes. "And what if it doesn't work, Richard? What if in the end I lose everything? My job, my reputation, my dignity? Then we'll rebuild, together. But we're not giving up now." Emily took a deep breath. She knew Richard was right. She knew that giving up would be letting Maurice and Patricia win. It would be letting them control her life, her choices, her future. And she hadn't come this far, hadn't fought so hard, just to throw in the towel now. "All right," she said, finally, wiping her tears. "We'll fight, but we do it my way, with intelligence, with strategy." Richard smiled. "Your way." They spent the entire weekend preparing their counter-offensive. Richard discreetly hired a private investigator to gather evidence on Maurice and Patricia's activities. Emily reviewed all her work files, documenting every achievement, every successful project, every contribution she had made to the company. She wasn't going to let anyone question her professional value. On Monday morning, Emily arrived at the office with a new determination. She wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to back down. She was going to face everything head-on, with the dignity that had always characterized her. But when she entered the meeting room for the first meeting of the day, she realized the game had changed levels, because sitting at the head of the table, with a triumphant smile on her face, was Patricia, and next to her Maurice with a folder of documents that clearly contained something important. "Good morning." "Emily," Patricia said, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "So glad you could make it. We have a lot to discuss." Chapter 4. Emily stood frozen in the doorway of the conference room, feeling the weight of all eyes on her. Besides Patricia and Maurice, 3 other directors were present, all with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. It was obvious that this was no ordinary meeting. It was a carefully planned ambush. "Come in, Emily," Maurice said, gesturing to an empty chair across the table. "We were just talking about you." Emily took a deep breath and entered the room. She wouldn't show weakness. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. She sat down with her back straight, placed her purse beside her chair, and folded her hands on the table. "What exactly were you talking about?" she asked, keeping her voice firm and professional. Patricia leaned forward, the smile still plastered on her face. "About some irregularities that have been brought to our attention. Irregularities involving you and, unfortunately, my ex-husband." Emily felt anger boil inside her, but she remained calm. "What kind of irregularities?" Maurice opened the folder in front of him. And took out some documents. Well, for starters, we have records here showing that you received a significant promotion 3 months ago, a promotion that coincidentally happened shortly after you and Mr. Almeida began your relationship. My promotion was based on merit, Emily replied without hesitation. I have all the reports and results that justify that decision. I can provide them right now if necessary. Maurice smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. Of course, no one is questioning your competence, Emily. What we are questioning is the ethics behind the decision. After all, it's questionable, to say the least, for an employee to be promoted by the man she's romantically involved with. One of the other directors, an older man with white hair named Albert, spoke up. Maurice is right, Emily. This puts the company in a delicate position. It could be interpreted as favoritism. And in times when we need to be transparent with our investors and shareholders, this kind of situation is problematic. Emily looked around the table, seeing the judgmental faces, the faces of those who had already made their decisions before even hearing her side. And then, something inside her snapped. She had spent weeks being intimidated, threatened, watched. She had endured it in silence, trying to be diplomatic, trying not to make waves. But now, sitting there, being accused of something she hadn't done, she realized that silence wouldn't protect her. Only the truth would. You want to talk about ethics, Emily said, her voice louder than she intended. Then let's talk. Let's talk about how someone invaded my privacy, hacked my phone, and stole personal files. Let's talk about the anonymous letters and threats I've been receiving for weeks. Let's talk about how a photo of me was taken without my consent and circulated in the company group chat. That is a lack of ethics. That is a crime. Patricia raised an eyebrow, still maintaining that irritating smile. I understand you're upset, Emily, but those are serious accusations. Do you have proof that someone did this? I'm gathering it, and when I have everything, I will not only present it here, but also take it to the proper authorities, because I will not allow you to continue harassing me with impunity. The silence that fell in the room was thick. Maurice exchanged a look with Patricia, and Emily saw the flaw in their plan. They didn't expect her to fight back. They expected her to cower, to apologize, to leave quietly. But she was no longer the same vulnerable woman who had cried in the building's basement months ago. She had found her strength, and she wasn't going to give it up now. It was Albert who broke the silence. I think we all need some time to cool down. Emily, I suggest you take a few days off. Paid, of course. And when we meet again, we expect everyone to bring concrete facts, not just accusations. Emily nodded. She was fine with that. She needed time to organize everything, to finalize the investigation Richard had started. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she turned to Patricia. One last thing. I don't know what you hope to gain from this, whether it's money, power, or simply revenge, but Richard is no longer yours. He made his choice when he signed the divorce papers, and nothing you do will change that. Patricia's smile vanished. For the first time, Emily saw something genuine on that face. It was anger. Pure, uncontrolled anger. And that confirmed what Emily already suspected. This wasn't just about money or divorce clauses. It was personal. Emily left the room with her head held high. Her colleagues stared as she walked down the hallways, but she no longer cared. She had more important things to worry about. When she reached the parking garage, she found Richard waiting for her, leaning against his car. He must have been warned about the meeting. Emily walked over to him, and when their eyes met, she saw the worry etched on his face. How did you know? She asked. I have my contacts. Someone called me, warning that Patricia and Maurice were plotting something. I came as fast as I could. Emily told him everything that had happened in the meeting. Richard listened in silence, his jaw growing tighter. When she finished, he shook his head. They've gone too far. I'm going to deal with this now. No, Emily said, placing a hand on his arm. Albert suggested I take a few days off, and I think it's a good idea. I need time to think, to pull myself together. And you need time to gather the evidence that will destroy their plan. Richard hesitated. I don't like the idea of you dealing with this alone. I won't be alone. I have you, I have Julia, and I have the truth on my side. That's more than enough." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. And then Richard pulled her into a tight hug. Emily buried her face in his chest, feeling a sense of security for the first time in weeks. "We'll get through this," Richard whispered. "I promise." Emily spent the next few days trying to disconnect from everything. She turned off her phone notifications, avoided checking work, emails, and spent hours walking around the city, rediscovering corners of New York she had forgotten. She went to Central Park early in the morning, when it was still empty and quiet. She sat by the lake and watched the ducks swim calmly, envying the simplicity of their existence. Julia visited her on Wednesday night, bringing pizza and a bottle of wine. They sat on the living room floor, eating straight from the box, just like they did in college. "Are you really okay?" Julia asked after a long silence. Emily pondered the question. "I'm tired, Julia. Tired of fighting. All the time. Tired of proving my worth. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just drop everything and start over somewhere else." Julia put her pizza slice aside and looked at her friend seriously. "Em, you're the strongest person I know. And I know it's hard right now, but you can't let these people win. Because if you give up, if you run away, they'll just keep doing this to other people. You have to fight, not just for yourself, but for all the women who go through this and don't have a voice to defend themselves." Julia's words echoed in Emily's mind for the rest of the night, and she realized her friend was right. This was bigger than her. It was about not letting people like Maurice and Patricia continue to use their power to destroy anyone who dared to challenge them. On Saturday, Richard took her to a place she had never been before. It was a small house in a town upstate, about 2 hours from New York City. The house belonged to his parents, who had passed away, but Richard kept it as a refuge for when he needed to get away from it all. "It's simple," he warned as they opened the door, "but it has a good energy." The house was indeed simple. 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a fireplace, a rustic kitchen. But the windows overlooked a beautiful garden, full of flowers that were clearly tended with care. "Who takes care of the garden?" Emily asked. "Mrs. Martha, a lady from the village. She was a friend of my mother's. After my mother passed, she kept coming here every week, taking care of the flowers. Says she does it because she knows my mother would have wanted." There was something touching about that story. Emily imagined this Mrs. Martha keeping alive the legacy of someone who was gone, just out of love and respect. It was beautiful. It was human. They spent the weekend there, away from everything and everyone. They cooked together, laughed at silly things, talked about life, about dreams, about the future that was still uncertain. And one night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky that Emily hadn't seen in years, Richard said something that changed everything. "Marry me." Emily turned to him, thinking she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me," Richard repeated, holding her hand. "I know it's soon, I know we're in the middle of a storm, but I also know that you're the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, and I don't want to wait until everything is perfect, because maybe it never will be. I want you. Now. Always." Emily's heart raced. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to throw herself into that possibility of happiness, of a new beginning. But another part, the rational and cautious part, made her hesitate. "Richard, I don't know if this is the right time. We're in the middle of a war. And if I accept now, they'll use it against us. They'll say it was for personal gain, for convenience." Richard shook his head. "I don't care what they'll say. I've never cared about other people's opinions. The only opinion that matters is yours." Emily looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and it was in that moment that she realized something important. She had spent her whole life caring too much about what others thought, about being seen as competent, as respectable, as worthy, but in the process she had forgotten to live for herself, to make choices based on what she really wanted, not on what she thought she should want. "I love you," she said, the words slipping out before she could process them. "I love you, Richard, but I need time. I first need to resolve this situation. I need to prove to myself that I can win this battle on my own. And when all this is over, When I know I'm with you because I chose to be, not because I was vulnerable or scared. Then I'll give you my answer." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, a sad smile on his face. "I understand, and I'll wait, for as long as it takes." They stood there, embracing under the starry sky, and Emily felt that she had made the right decision, even if it hurt, even if part of her wanted to just say yes and forget everything else. The following Monday, Emily returned to work, determined. The private investigator Richard had hired had finally obtained concrete evidence, emails exchanged between Maurice and Patricia, coordinating the threats, records of payments made to a hacker to breach Emily's phone, even recordings of conversations where they openly discussed their plan to destroy her reputation to weaken Richard. Emily and Richard scheduled a meeting with the board of directors. All members were present, including Maurice and other executives. Patricia was also invited, as part of the accusations directly involved her. The meeting began formally, with the chairman of the board opening the session, but it was Richard who took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. We are here today to address a serious situation that affects not only me personally, but the integrity of this company. Over the past few months, an orchestrated campaign of defamation and harassment has been conducted against Ms. Emily Santos, a senior analyst at this company, and I have here the proof of who is behind it." He gave a signal, and the screen in the conference room lit up. Emails, conversations, bank statements began to appear, all meticulously organized with dates, times, and amounts. As the evidence was presented, Emily saw Maurice's face grow paler and paler. Patricia, on the other hand, maintained a mask of indifference, but her eyes betrayed her panic. "This is ridiculous," Maurice protested, standing up. "This evidence could have been fabricated. It proves nothing." "On the contrary," said Albert, the eldest director, "it proves a great deal, and it's substantial enough for us to take to the authorities. Maurice, you are suspended immediately, pending a formal investigation, and Patricia, although you are no longer part of this company, we will be taking legal action against you." Patricia finally lost her composure. "You can't do this. I have rights. I have lawyers." "And so do we," Richard replied calmly. "And ours have evidence. What do yours have?" The silence that followed was deafening. Maurice gathered his belongings and left the room without another word. Patricia followed him, but not before casting one last look of hatred at Richard and Emily. When the door closed behind them, Emily felt as if an immense weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was over. The war was over. Albert turned to her. "Emily, on behalf of the board, I would like to apologize for what you've been through. No employee should have to deal with this. And we want to make it clear that your position in this company is based on merit, and always has been. Your results speak for themselves." Emily nodded, feeling her eyes burn. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." The meeting was adjourned, and the directors left one by one. When they were finally alone, Richard approached Emily. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Emily smiled. "Yes, we did." But even with the victory, Emily felt that something had changed within her. That whole process, that whole struggle, had forced her to face truths about herself that she had avoided for a long time. She realized she had spent years building a life based on what she thought she should be, not on what she really wanted. In the days that followed, Emily began to ask herself difficult questions. Did she really want to stay at the company? Did that career, that path still make sense for her? And more importantly, did she want to build a life with Richard there, under everyone's watchful eyes? Or did she prefer something different? It was on a Friday afternoon, while organizing some documents at her desk, that Emily had an epiphany. She looked around the office, seeing people rushing back and forth, trapped in their routines, chasing targets that didn't always make sense. And she realized that this was no longer enough for her. She wanted more. She wanted something that made her heart truly beat. That night, she went to Richard's apartment. He opened the door with a smile, but soon noticed that something was different about her. "We need to talk," Emily said. They sat on the sofa, and Emily took a deep breath before speaking. "Richard, I love you. That hasn't changed. But I realized something in these past few weeks. I realized I've been living the life I thought I should live, not the life I really want. Richard remained quiet, just listening. I need to leave the company, Emily continued. I need to find my own path, my own identity, outside the shadow of all this, and I need to do it alone. Richard swallowed hard. Are you breaking up with me? No, I'm asking for some time. Time for me to find myself, to be sure that when I come back, if I come back, it's because it's what I really want. Not because I was scared, or because I needed protection, or because you saved me, but because I chose you freely and consciously. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she spoke, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She saw the pain on Richard's face, but she also saw understanding. How long? He asked, his voice hoarse. I don't know. Maybe a few months, maybe more, but I promise I'll come back. And when I do, you'll have my answer about the marriage proposal. Richard nodded, wiping his own tears. I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes. They held each other, as if for the last time, even though they knew it wasn't. It was just to see you later. A necessary step so they could both grow individually, before growing together. A week later, Emily handed in her resignation letter. Albert tried to convince her to stay, offering promotions, a salary increase. But she politely refused everything. Her decision was made. She spent her last few days at the company organizing her departure, handing over her projects to other colleagues. On her last day, Julia organized a simple farewell, just with their closest friends. There were hugs, tears, promises to keep in touch. When Emily left the building for the last time, with a box containing her personal belongings, she felt a mixture of sadness and relief. She was closing an important chapter of her life, but she was also making room for something new. Something she didn't know exactly what it was yet, but that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She looked back one last time, at the building where she had worked, where she had met Richard, where she had fought her battles, and then she turned and started walking, toward an uncertain, but possibility-filled future. Chapter 5. The first thing Emily did after leaving the company was to go back to Columbus. She didn't plan to stay long, just enough to reconnect with her roots, with the person she was before New York, before all the rush and ambition that had consumed the last years of her life. Her parents were surprised when she showed up at the door of the house where she grew up, a simple building in a quiet neighborhood of the city. "My dear." "What happened?" asked her mother, Mary, hugging her tightly. "Is everything all right?" "It is, Mom. I just needed some time. I needed to come home." The first few days in Columbus were strange. Emily had grown so accustomed to the frantic pace of New York that the calm of her hometown seemed almost unnatural. The mornings were silent, the streets empty. Time seemed to pass differently, slower, more gently. She started helping her father, Anthony, at the hardware store, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She wanted to feel the weight of tools in her hands, the smell of metal and wood, the simplicity of serving customers who had known her since she was a child. Mrs. Laura, the longtime neighbor, would come into the store and ask about her life in New York. Mr. Joachim, the retired carpenter, came every week to buy nails and always had a story to tell. It was comforting. It was real. It was everything Emily didn't know she was missing. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing shelves, her father approached her. "Are you running away or finding yourself?" he asked, direct as always. Emily stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "I don't know, Dad. A little of both, maybe." Anthony nodded, as if he understood perfectly. "You know, when your mother and I got married, I thought I knew everything about life. I thought all you had to do was work hard, be honest, and things would work out. But life taught me it's not quite like that. Sometimes you have to stop. You have to look inside. You have to question if the path you're on is really yours, or if you're just following what others expect of you." Emily felt her father's words resonate deep within her. That was exactly it. She had spent so much time trying to prove her worth, trying to be successful on society's terms, that she had forgotten to ask what truly made her happy. "And did you find your answers?" she asked. Anthony smiled. I did. I discovered that my happiness was in the simple things, in this store, in your mother, in you kids. I didn't need much more than that. But everyone has to find their own answers, Emily. No one can do it for you. That conversation stayed with Emily for the following days. She began to reflect on what she really wanted from life, and she realized she had lost sight of something essential. She had let herself be consumed by her career, by status, by the need to prove she was good enough. But in the process, she had forgotten to live, to enjoy the small moments, to value genuine connections. 2 weeks after arriving in Columbus, Emily received a call from Julia. Her friend was worried, wanting to know how she was, if she needed anything. "I'm fine, Julia. Better than I've been in a long time," Emily said, sitting on the porch of her parents' house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "And Richard, has he called you?" "We've exchanged a few messages. Nothing deep, just to, no, we're okay. But I'm respecting the time I asked for. I need to do this for myself." Julia sighed on the other end of the line. "I get it, Em, but don't take too long, okay? That man really loves you, and men like that are rare." Emily smiled. "I know, and I love him too. But I need to be sure I'm ready to build a life with him. I don't want to look back in a few years and have regrets. I want to be absolutely sure." After a month in Columbus, Emily felt it was time to continue her journey. She didn't want to go back to New York yet. She needed more time, more experiences, more self-discovery. She decided to travel. She didn't have a specific itinerary, just a backpack, some saved money, and the desire to get a little lost to find herself. Her first stop was Marietta, a historic town a few hours from Columbus. She rented a simple room in an inn and spent days exploring the cobblestone streets, the surrounding waterfalls, the small craft shops. She talked to local artists, learned a bit about pottery from a lady who had a studio hidden in a narrow alley. It was there that Emily realized something important. She realized she had a talent for listening to people, for understanding their stories, for asking questions that led them to reflect on their own lives. And that got her thinking. Maybe her true calling wasn't in numbers and spreadsheets, but in people, in stories, in human connections. From Marietta, she went on to Hocking Hills State Park. There, surrounded by lush nature, challenging trails, and the crystal-clear waters of the waterfalls, Emily felt something open up inside her. It was as if every step she took on the trails was also a step towards herself. Every waterfall bath washed away not only the sweat and dust, but also the doubts and fears she carried. One night, sitting around a campfire with other travelers, a guy from Washington, D.C. asked each person what they were looking for on their journey. When it was Emily's turn, she was silent for a long moment before answering. "I'm looking to remember who I am, when I'm not trying to be what others expect, when I'm not trying to prove anything, just me in my truest form." The words came out with an honesty that surprised her, and she realized she was getting close to understanding what she really wanted. After 2 months of traveling, Emily decided to head to the coast. She chose a small fishing village in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a place so quiet it seemed to have been forgotten by time. She rented a simple house facing the sea and spent her mornings walking on the beach, her feet sinking into the wet sand, the sound of the waves calming her mind. It was there that she finally allowed her thoughts to return, completely to Richard. She had avoided thinking about him too much during her travels, wanting to focus on herself. But now, with a clearer mind and a lighter heart, she allowed the memories to come. She remembered their first meeting in the building's basement, the way he had listened without judgment, the notes that appeared on her door, the dinner at the Italian trattoria, the deep conversations in his apartment, the marriage proposal under the starry sky, and how hard it had been to say no, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved herself enough to know. She needed that time. Emily picked up her phone and looked at the messages they had exchanged over the months. They were short, respectful messages with no pressure. Richard shared small moments of his day, a photo of a book he was reading, a song that made him think of her, a sunset seen from his apartment window. And he always ended by saying he was waiting, that she could take all the time she needed. There was so much love in those messages, so much respect, so much patience. And Emily realized that Richard was growing too. He was, also learning to give space, to trust, to love without suffocating. She began to reply more often. She told him about her travels, about the people she had met, about the discoveries she was making about herself. And slowly, without even realizing it, they began to really talk again. Not like before, trapped amidst crises and threats, but as two people who choose to be present for each other, even from a distance. It was during one of these conversations late at night, with the sound of the sea in the background, that Richard asked a question that changed everything. "Do you know what you want to do when you get back yet?" Emily thought for a moment before answering, "I think so. I want to work with people. I want to hear stories. I want to help other women who have been through what I've been through. I want to create something that's mine, that has my purpose, my essence." "That's beautiful, Em, and I'll support you in whatever you decide." Richard's words were simple, but they carried a deep meaning. He wasn't trying to direct her. He wasn't offering solutions or easy paths. He was simply saying he would be there. And that was all Emily needed to hear. 3.5 months after leaving New York, Emily felt she was ready. Not ready to return to the life she had before, but ready to build something new, something that was truly hers. She returned to New York on a Thursday afternoon. The city was bustling as always, but this time Emily didn't feel suffocated by it. She felt energized, because now she knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. Before meeting Richard, Emily did something important. She went to her old building and asked to speak with some of the women on the administrative staff, women she had seen for years, but with whom she had never really talked. And she listened to their stories. She heard about the emotional abuse they suffered, about unfair wages, about dreams deferred because they needed to support their families. And it was there in those conversations that the idea finally crystallized. Emily was going to create a non-profit organization to support women in the workforce. She would offer career guidance, emotional support, connections to opportunities. She would use everything she had learned, both in her career and in the difficulties she faced, to help other women find their paths. When she finally went to meet Richard, it was a Friday night. She had told him she was coming back, but hadn't given details, just said she wanted to see him. They arranged to meet at his apartment. Emily went up the 12 floors in the elevator with her heart pounding. Not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of anticipation, because she knew exactly what she was going to say, and she knew it was the right decision. When the door opened, there was Richard. He had changed. His hair was a little longer. There was a lightness to his face that wasn't there before, and when their eyes met, Emily saw everything she needed to see: love, respect, patience, and acceptance. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and then Emily took a step forward and hugged him. Richard wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there, embracing, without saying anything, just feeling each other's presence. When they finally separated, Richard led Emily to the living room. He had prepared tea just like that first night they spent together. They sat on the sofa, each with a cup in hand, and Emily began to talk. She told him about everything, about Columbus, about her travels, about her discoveries, about the project she wanted to create, about the woman she had become. Richard listened attentively without interrupting, just absorbing every word, and when she finished, he smiled. "You're radiant," he said. "Different. More yourself than ever." Emily smiled too. "I found myself, Richard. I finally understood that I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I don't need to be the best, the most successful, the most this or that. I just need to be me, and be happy being me." Richard took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "And are you happy?" Emily looked at him, her heart overflowing. "I'm getting there, and I want to continue on this path. But this time, I want to do it with you by my side." Richard held his breath. "Does that mean—" Emily nodded, her eyes welling up. "Yes. My answer is yes. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. Not because I need you, but because I choose you, because I love you, and because I know that together we are better than we are apart." Richard pulled Emily into a kiss. It was a different kiss from all the others. It wasn't urgent or desperate. It was calm, deep, full of promises and certainties. When they separated, they were both crying, but they were tears of happiness. They spent the night talking about the future, about the wedding they wanted, simple and intimate, about Emily's project, which Richard promised to support in every way, about the possibility of him reducing his workload at the company to have more time to live, really live, not just exist between meetings and responsibilities. Richard told her that he had changed during those months too, that he had realized he needed to delegate more, to trust his team more, that he had started therapy to deal with his own loneliness and the fear of opening his heart, that he had learned that loving someone wasn't about protecting or controlling, but about giving freedom and trust. It was almost dawn when they finally went to sleep. Emily fell asleep in Richard's arms, feeling complete in a way she had never felt before. Not because he completed her, but because she had completed herself. And now whole, she could share her life with someone without getting lost in the process. In the following days, they began to plan. The wedding would be simple, just family and close friends. It would be at the house upstate, the one that had belonged to Richard's parents. Mrs. Martha, the lady who took care of the garden, was thrilled with the news and promised to make the garden even more beautiful for the occasion. Emily also started working on her project. She found a small space to rent in an accessible neighborhood of New York. She started forming partnerships with other organizations, with companies that believed in the cause, with women who had stories similar to hers and wanted to help. Julia was one of the first volunteers. She would use her marketing experience to help promote the work. And slowly other women joined, women who had faced discrimination, harassment, inequality, women who wanted to turn their pain into purpose. The project was named The Fresh Start, and its symbol was a phoenix representing the ability to rise from the ashes, to reinvent oneself, to find strength even in the most difficult situations. Maurice, the former director, had been formally dismissed after internal investigations. Patricia had dropped her legal claims after it became clear that the evidence against her was overwhelming. Both had left Emily and Richard's lives, leaving behind only lessons on how not to be consumed by ambition and resentment. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emily received a surprise. It was a letter, sent by mail. When she opened it, she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Thomas, her ex-boyfriend. The letter was short. He apologized for what he had done, for the betrayal, for the way he had hurt her. He said that he had matured, that he had understood his mistakes, and he wished her happiness, saying he had heard about the wedding and that she deserved to be happy. Emily read the letter twice. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel resentment. She just felt a peaceful indifference. Thomas was part of a past that no longer defined her. He was a turned page, a closed chapter. She folded the letter and put it in a drawer. She wasn't going to reply. There was no need. Some stories end without an elaborate finale. And that was okay. On the eve of the wedding, Emily and her bridesmaids, including Julia and her cousins from Columbus, went to the house upstate. The night was filled with laughter, conversation, and plans for the future. Mrs. Martha prepared a delicious dinner with traditional recipes she had learned from Richard's mother. Emily looked around the table, seeing the faces of the people she loved, and felt a deep gratitude for everything she had been through, for all the difficulties, for all the hard choices, because all of it had brought her here, to this moment of peace, of fulfillment, of true love. When she finally retired to bed, alone for her last night as a single woman, Emily stared out the window at the moonlit garden. The flowers swayed gently in the night breeze, and she thought about how unpredictable life was, how a chance encounter in a basement could change everything, how pain could turn into growth, how an end could be just a new beginning. Tomorrow would be the wedding day, the day she and Richard would promise each other not perfection, but presence, not answers, but companionship in the questions, not a fairy tale, but a real story, full of ups and downs, but built with love, respect, and the courage to choose every day to be together. Emily closed her eyes and slept, her heart at peace, ready for the next chapter of her life. Chapter 6. The day dawned bright and sunny, as if the sky itself wanted to bless that moment. Emily woke to the sound of birds singing and the smell of fresh coffee coming from the kitchen. For a moment, she lay there just watching the sunlight stream through the window, creating golden patterns on the white walls of the room. It was her wedding day. The day she would make official the love she had chosen to build with Richard. There was no nervousness. There were no doubts, just a deep peace and an unshakable certainty that she was making the right choice. Julia entered the room carrying a tray with coffee, fruit and bread. "Good morning, bride," she said, with a radiant smile. "Ready for the big day?" Emily sat up in bed, accepting the cup of coffee her friend offered. More than ever. The next few hours were a mix of calm preparations and moments of pure emotion. Mary, Emily's mother, was more nervous than her own daughter, checking every detail 1,000 times, adjusting the flowers, rearranging the chairs in the garden. Anthony, her father, watched everything with a discreet smile, but Emily saw the tears he was trying to hide. Mrs. Martha had transformed the garden into a true paradise. Flowers of every color adorned every corner. There were delicate arrangements on the white chairs arranged in a semicircle. A simple but beautiful arch decorated with foliage and white roses marked the makeshift altar where the ceremony would take place. Around noon, Emily began to get ready. The dress she had chosen was simple and elegant, a natural silk model with a straight cut, no exaggerations. She wanted something that represented her, that was comfortable, that allowed her to be herself. No great pomp, no ostentation, just the essence of love in its purest form. Julia helped with her hair, tying it in a low, loose bun, with a few strands escaping naturally. The makeup was light, just enhancing her natural features. When she was finally ready, Emily looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because there was something new there. A sparkle in her eyes, a serenity on her face, the mark of someone who had found her place in the world. Her mother entered the room and stopped at the door, bringing a hand to her mouth. "My daughter, you look beautiful." Emily turned and hugged her mother, feeling her tremble with emotion. "Thank you for everything, Mum. For teaching me to be strong, for letting me fly, for always being here when I need to come home." Mary stepped back a little, wiping her tears. "I just want you to be happy, my dear, and looking at you now, I see that you are." The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. The guests began to arrive gradually. There were few people, only the closest ones. Emily's family had come from Columbus, some friends of both, co-workers who had become true companions. And of course the women from the Fresh Start project, whom Emily had insisted on inviting. They were a fundamental part of her new life, her new identity. Richard was in the garden, greeting the guests with Domenico, the owner of the Italian trattoria, who had insisted on personally preparing the entire feast. The two had become close friends in recent months, and Domenico considered this wedding almost as if it were his own family's. When the time came, everyone took their places. The officiant, a simple gentleman chosen at Mrs. Martha's suggestion, took his place under the arch of flowers. The guests sat down, and then a soft music began to play, performed on the guitar by a local musician. Emily appeared at the door of the house, arm in arm with her father. Anthony was elegant in a simple suit, but it was the emotion on his face that really drew attention. He squeezed his daughter's arm, took a deep breath and began to walk. Richard waited at the altar. He wore a light grey suit, no tie, with his shirt slightly open at the collar. His hair was a bit unruly, as always, and there were already tears streaming down his face. When his eyes met Emily's, he smiled, and in that smile, Emily saw everything. Love, gratitude, the promise of a future built together. She walked slowly down the aisle formed by the chairs, feeling the loving gazes of everyone there. But her eyes were fixed on Richard, on the man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most, who had been patient when she needed time, who had believed in her even when she doubted herself. When she reached the altar, Anthony kissed his daughter's forehead and placed her hand in Richard's. "Take care of her," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Richard nodded. With my life. The officiant began the ceremony with simple words about the meaning of marriage, about how it wasn't just the union of two people, but the conscious choice to build a life together, with all the difficulties and joys that entailed. He spoke of respect, of companionship, of the importance of growing together without losing one's individuality. And then came the time for the vows. Richard went first. He held Emily's hands, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Emily, when I first saw you in that basement, I didn't know I was standing before the woman who would change my life. You were broken, vulnerable, but even so, there was a strength in you that fascinated me. And as I got to know you, I realized you weren't just strong, you were brave, you were real, you were everything I had been looking for my whole life without knowing I was looking. You taught me that to love is not to control, it's to give freedom, it's to trust, it's to be present even in absence. I promise you that I will be your partner in every sense, in good days and bad, in victories and defeats, and I promise to never stop seeing you as I saw you on that first day, as an extraordinary woman who deserves to be loved exactly as she is. Tears streamed freely down Emily's face. She squeezed Richard's hands and began to speak, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. Richard, you appeared in my life at a time when I had lost faith, in myself, in others, in love. And you showed me that there was still beauty in the world, that there was still genuine kindness, that it was still worth believing. But more than that, you gave me something I didn't know I needed. You gave me space to grow, to find myself, to discover who I really am. And when I came back, when I was finally whole, you were still there, waiting. Not because you needed me, but because you chose to wait for me. And today, before everyone we love, I choose you. I choose to build a life by your side. I choose the challenges and the joys. I choose the love that is daily work, constant commitment, and a renewed choice each morning. I promise to be your companion, your partner, your best friend, and I promise to never stop being myself in the process. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Even Domenico, who considered himself a tough Italian, discreetly wiped away tears. The officiant smiled, clearly moved as well, and proceeded with the ceremony. When it came time for the rings, it was Julia who brought them. They were simple white gold bands with a discreet inscription on the inside. On Richard's it read, "You taught me to be free." On Emily's, "You taught me to choose." They exchanged the rings, placing them on each other's fingers with care, as if sealing not just a commitment, but a transformation. And when the officiant finally said they could kiss, Richard pulled Emily close and kissed her, with all the intensity of someone who had been waiting for that moment, for months. The guests applauded, stood up, shouted congratulations, but for Emily and Richard the world had shrunk to that moment, to that kiss, to that certainty that they had made the right choice. The party that followed was exactly as they wanted it, simple, joyful, full of love. Domenico had prepared a mouth-watering Italian feast, fresh pasta, homemade sauces, colorful salads, warm bread, and for dessert, a simple Sicilian lemon cake, Emily's favorite. There were emotional speeches. Julia made everyone laugh and cry by telling stories from their college days, ending with a toast to a friendship that withstands time and distance. Anthony spoke briefly, saying only that a father couldn't ask for more than to see his daughter happy. And when it was Richard's turn, he simply looked at Emily and said, "Thank you for choosing me." The afternoon gave way to evening, and the garden was illuminated by hundreds of candles and discreet fairy lights hanging in the trees. There was music, dancing, laughter. Emily danced an emotional waltz with her father. Richard danced with Mrs. Martha, who kept repeating how proud his mother would be. And when they were finally alone late at night, with the last guests saying their goodbyes, Emily and Richard sat on the porch steps watching the still-lit garden. "We did it," Emily said, resting her head on Richard's shoulder. "We did it," he repeated, kissing the top of her head. "And it's just the beginning." The following months were ones of adaptation and construction. Emily and Richard decided to live in his apartment for the time being, but with plans to eventually find a place that was truly theirs. The Fresh Start project grew rapidly, serving more and more women, forming important partnerships, gaining recognition in the media. Richard, true to his promise, drastically reduced his workload at the company. He placed trusted people in key positions, delegated responsibilities, and began working only 4 days a week. The other 3 were dedicated to his personal life, to the projects that really mattered, to quality time with Emily. They traveled whenever they could, not luxurious or exotic trips, but meaningful getaways. They returned to the house upstate frequently. They went to Columbus to visit Emily's family. They discovered new places within their own country, always seeking genuine connections with people and places. And then, 2 years after the wedding, came the news. That would change everything again. Emily was pregnant. The discovery came on a Sunday morning when she woke up feeling nauseous. She took the test, almost in disbelief, and when the 2 lines appeared, she felt a mixture of joy and terror. Was she ready to be a mother? Could she balance the project, the marriage, and motherhood? When she told Richard, he scooped her up in his arms and spun her around the room, laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to be parents, Em. We're going to be parents." The pregnancy was smooth. Emily continued working on the project until the 7th month, when she finally agreed to take a leave. Richard was present at every appointment, every ultrasound, every moment of anxiety or joy. Helen was born on a rainy March afternoon, weighing 7.5 pounds and with her father's dark eyes. When Emily held her for the first time, she felt a love so immense she thought her chest would burst. Richard was by her side, crying openly, touching his daughter's tiny face with trembling fingers. "It's her," he whispered. "Our girl." Motherhood transformed Emily in ways she hadn't expected. It brought new challenges, sleepless nights, constant worries, but it also brought a fullness she didn't know existed. Seeing Richard as a father was a wonderful discovery. He was patient, dedicated, playful. He sang off-key lullabies that put Helen to sleep. He changed diapers without complaining. He woke up in the middle of the night to soothe the baby and let Emily rest. 3 years after Helen's birth, Peter came along, another boy with dark eyes, but with his mother's smile. This time, the house was already prepared. They had moved into a larger house with a yard and trees in a quieter neighborhood of New York. It wasn't as luxurious as Richard's apartment, but it had something that one never had. It had a soul. It had life. It had the sound of children running, of laughter, of love. And so they arrived at the moment where it all had begun. 5 years after the wedding, 7 years after that first meeting in the building's basement. It was a Saturday morning. Emily was in the kitchen making pancakes, the special recipe the kids loved. Helen, now 5, was sitting at the table coloring a picture. Peter, too, was on the living room floor playing with building blocks. Richard appeared in the kitchen with his hair completely disheveled, wearing only shorts and an old t-shirt. He tripped over a forgotten toy on the floor, almost falling, and let out a laugh. "This house is a minefield," Emily laughed, flipping the pancakes. "You should have seen it before you woke up. I've already picked up at least 20 toys. Richard came up behind her, wrapping her in a hug and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "That the best day of my life was when you treated me like an ordinary person." Emily turned to him, the spatula still in her hand, and smiled. That phrase had become a kind of mantra between them. Richard repeated it whenever he wanted to express gratitude for the path they had walked, for the simplicity they had chosen, for the love they had built brick by brick. She took his face in her hands, looking deep into the eyes she knew so well. "And the best mistake of my life was confusing love with simplicity." They kissed, a soft kiss full of history. Helen made a disgusted sound from the table, saying that kissing was gross. Peter clapped his hands, even without understanding what was happening. And at that moment, in that messy kitchen, with the smell of pancakes in the air and toys scattered on the floor, Emily realized she had everything she had ever wanted. It wasn't a perfect life. There were hard days. There were arguments about who would take the kids to school, about bills to pay, about projects that went wrong. But it was their life. built with conscious choices, with true love, with the courage to be vulnerable and the strength to start over as many times as necessary. The Fresh Start project had expanded. It now had 3 locations in New York and was opening branches in other cities. Hundreds of women had been helped. Stories of overcoming multiplied. And Emily knew that this was her legacy, more important than any corporate title, more meaningful than any traditional professional recognition. Richard had found his own balance. He continued to lead the company, but in a different way, more human, more present. He created development programs for employees, policies for work-life balance, spaces for listening and support. The company thrived not in spite of these changes, but because of them. That afternoon, after breakfast and the inevitable mess of cleaning up 2 children covered in jam and chocolate syrup, they went to the park. It was a weekend ritual. Helen ran ahead, always eager to get to the swings. Peter was in his father's arms, pointing at every dog he saw and shouting excitedly. Emily and Richard sat on a bench while the children played under careful supervision. He took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers as they had done since their first meeting. "There's something I never told you," Richard said, looking at the children. Emily turned to him, curious. "What?" "That night in the basement, when I first saw you, I had already been there for almost an hour, just observing, thinking about life, questioning everything. And then you appeared, with that pain in your eyes, with that box of memories you were throwing away. And I saw in you something I had lost a long time ago. Hope. The idea that it was still possible to start over, that it was still worth trying." Emily squeezed his hand. "I saw you too, Richard. I saw a man who was just as lost as I was. And maybe that's what connected us. We weren't 2 whole people meeting. We were 2 broken people learning to glue the pieces back together." They were silent for a moment, just watching the children. Helen had made friends with a girl and they were playing hide-and-seek. Peter was trying to climb up the wrong side of the slide, determined as always. "Do you regret anything?" Richard asked. Emily thought about the question. She thought about Thomas, about the betrayal that had shattered her world. She thought about the threats, the fear, the sleepless nights. She thought about leaving her career, about asking for time, about all the difficult choices she had made. "No," she replied finally, "not a single thing, because everything brought me here, to you, to them." Richard smiled. "I don't regret anything either, not even losing you for a few months, because when you came back whole, and that made all the difference." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was time to go home. Time for the kids' bath, for dinner, for bedtime stories. The simple, beautiful routine they had built. On the way back, Peter fell asleep in the car. Helen was in the back seat singing a song she had learned at school. Emily looked at Richard, who was driving with one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers. "I love you," she said. He turned briefly, smiling. "I love you too, today, tomorrow, and all the days that follow." Because in the end, what seemed to be just a chance encounter in the basement of a building had been the beginning of something extraordinary. A story of fresh starts, of courage, of a love that chooses, that works, that persists. A love that didn't arrive with fireworks but with a cup of tea, a silent hallway, and the courage to see beyond appearances. And as the city of New York lit up with its thousands of lights, in that simple car, in that imperfect and beautiful family, there was everything that truly mattered. There was love, there was choice, there was life being lived in its truest and most beautiful form.